The city shone with neon lights as Daniel crossed the central avenue with a firm step. He was wearing an impeccable suit, the same one he used for his most important meetings. The office of his company, one of the most influential firms in business. Consulting stood as a monument to success, but for him, it was a gilded cage. Upon entering the building, he greeted his colleagues with a practiced smile, the same one he wore to every meeting, every negotiation, every social interaction. He knew exactly what to say, how to move, how to project confidence. And yet, in recent months, a sensation haunted him, a crack in his perfect image. That night, after an exhausting day, he returned to his minimalist designed apartment where every object seemed calculated to fit into an impersonal aesthetic. He stopped in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at himself, not his external image, but what was behind his eyes. There was the void, a silent question I couldn't ignore. Who am I really? The sound of a notification brought him out of his thoughts. His phone showed an email from the company's CEO. "Daniel, we need to talk about the investor presentation tomorrow. There have been some errors in the reports." A shiver ran down his spine. Mistakes. He couldn't afford to fail. His reputation was at stake. But something inside him knew that. It wasn't just the error in the report that bothered him. It was the fear of being exposed, that the image he had built with so much effort was nothing more than a house of cards. He sat down on the couch and looked at the ceiling. He remembered the words of his old college philosophy professor. The real crisis is not when we fail, but when we realize that we don't know who we are without our achievements. At the time, he had considered it an idealistic speech, but now, for the first time, it made sense to him. Insomnia caught him that night. He tried to distract himself by watching motivational videos about leadership and success, but none of them managed to calm the uneasy feeling. He got out of bed and started pacing back and forth. Something inside him was screaming to come out. An inner voice he had ignored for too long. He walked to his desk and pulled out an old notebook that he carried everywhere but rarely used. He wrote a question on the first page. When did I start to feel like an imposter? The words stared at him from the paper, daring him to go deeper. He closed his eyes and let the memories flow. The image of his father appeared in his mind. A serious, successful man with an imposing presence. Since he was a child, Daniel had learned that success was the only way to be worthy of recognition. Never show weakness, his father told him. Leaders cannot afford to hesitate. He realized that his life had been a perpetual race to prove that. He was good enough, strong enough, capable enough. But what if all that was just a mask? What if at the end of the day, he didn't know who he was beyond the role he played? He looked at himself in the mirror again, but this time with a new question in mind. Are you ready to discover the truth? Unknowingly, that moment would mark the beginning of a journey that would change his life forever. The next morning, Daniel woke up feeling restless. He dressed as meticulously as always, adjusting his tie in front of the mirror. However, now he noticed something different. The image he projected did not feel like his own. It was as if I were playing a role in a play that I didn't remember choosing. As he walked to the office, his mind traveled to the past. He remembered how, from a young age, he felt compelled to be strong. In his family, showing doubt or weakness was never an option. His father, a ruthless businessman, had taught him that the world was a battlefield and only the toughest survived. You're a leader, Daniel. Never let anyone see your flaws, she had told him more than once. At the office, the meeting with the CEO was more tense than expected. Daniel struggled to maintain his composure, assuring that errors in the reports would be corrected immediately. But inside him, something kept cracking. How long could I sustain this facade? That night, he decided to contact someone he hadn't seen in years, his old philosophy professor, Dr. Salgado. I need to talk to you, he wrote in a message. To his surprise, the response came quickly. See you tomorrow at my studio. When Daniel entered the professor's office, he was greeted with a warm smile. "Tell me, Daniel, what wind brings you here?" With a sigh, Daniel responded, "I think I've been living a lie, and I don't know who I am without my success." The professor nodded with interest. "Then it's time for us to talk about archetypes." That night, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about what his old teacher had told him. Archetypes are universal patterns in the human psyche. We all live under its influence, consciously or unconsciously. That resonated deeply with him, but he still didn't fully understand its true meaning. Upon arriving home, he felt the need to continue exploring. He walked to his bookshelf and pulled out a book he had bought years ago but had never read, The Man and His Symbols, by Carl Jung. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and began to read, turning page after page with increasing fascination. In a chapter on archetypes, he found a description that made his skin crawl. The warrior is one who fights tirelessly, driven by the need to conquer and prove his worth. His greatest virtue is discipline and determination. His greatest danger is getting lost in battle without really knowing what he is fighting for. Daniel felt a chill. That was his life. Always moving forward, always trying harder, always seeking victory. But for what? What was your real war? Tiredness overcame him, and he fell asleep with the book on his chest. He found himself on a fog-covered battlefield. Everything around him was chaos, the roar of clashing swords, screams of fury and pain, the smell of metal and blood in the air. Instinctively, he raised his sword and prepared to fight. His heart was pounding. He attacked furiously, cutting shadows that faded into the mist. He fought with all his being, but he never saw his enemy clearly. He just knew that he had to keep going, that he couldn't stop. But then, in the middle of the fog, a voice echoed, "Why are you fighting, Daniel?" He stopped dead. He looked around. Who had spoken? He couldn't see anyone, but the question paralyzed him. He felt the weight of his sword in his hand. Suddenly, he realized how tired he was. His arms were shaking, his breathing was heavy. "Who are you fighting?" The voice insisted. He looked around again and saw that there were no enemies. Only his own shadow reflected in the mist. And he woke up. His heart was still pounding. He sat on the bed, covered in cold sweat. The dream had hit him like a revelation. He had been fighting all his life, but he had never stopped to ask himself why. For the first time, he understood that the battle was not against others. It was against himself. The sound of rain tapped softly on the window as Daniel poured himself a second cup of coffee. The night before had been unsettling. He couldn't stop thinking about his dream and the question that had haunted him until he woke up. "Who are you?" "Fighting?" He leaned back in his chair and let his mind travel to the past. "I was 6 years old." His father was sitting across from him at the large wooden dining room table, his expression cold and imposing. On the table was a notebook with math exercises. "Get a 9 again, and you'll disappoint me, Daniel," his father said without looking up from the newspaper. "I don't raise you to be, will he raise you to be the best?" Little Daniel nodded silently. He wanted to tell him that a 9 was a good grade, that the teacher had congratulated him, that his mother was proud. But I knew none of that mattered. Years later, the scenario changed, but the message remained the same. As a teenager, every soccer game was a trial by fire. Every academic competition a battle where only first place counted. If he won, his father would nod approvingly. If he lost, his gaze became distant and his silence ate him up inside. He learned to associate success with love. If you are the best, you deserve to be seen. If you fail, you disappear. Daniel returned to the present with a sigh. He had never allowed himself to admit it, but all his effort, all his obsession with being the best, had not been for him. It had been because of that child who still lived inside him, the one who was still waiting to hear, "I'm proud of you." But that phrase never came. He got up and walked to the mirror. His reflection looked back at him, but now he saw something else. Not just the businessman, the respected leader, the tireless strategist. He also saw the boy who still feared he wasn't enough. How much of who I am is really mine? And how much is just the echo of a child seeking approval? One more question hit him hard. Can I be a leader without needing to be admired? It was a dangerous question, because if the answer was yes, it meant that everything he had built was based on a childhood need. But if the answer was no, then who was he really? He didn't have answers yet, but for the first time in his life, he was willing to find them. Daniel was again in the office of his old professor, Dr. Ezekiel Montiel, a man with graying hair and a penetrating but warm gaze. The room smelled of coffee and old books. "Tell me, Daniel," the professor asked, crossing his fingers on the desk. "Have you ever heard of the shadow?" Daniel nodded cautiously. "I've read about it in Jung," he replied. "It's the part of us that we repress, what we don't want to admit we are." Montiel smiled slightly. "Exact. The shadow is everything we have denied in ourselves because society, family, or our own morals have told us it is unacceptable. But there is something that many people don't understand. He leaned forward slightly. It's not just darkness. It is also power. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "Explain. The shadow is not just your fears, your insecurities, or your repressed anger. It is also your untapped potential, your stifled creativity, your true voice buried under years of other people's expectations. And do you know what the problem is? That the more you deny it, the more control it has over you." Daniel clenched his jaw. He felt exposed. "So how am I supposed to face her?" Montiel got up and walked slowly around the room. "Take a good look at yourself, Daniel. You wear a mask of arrogance and self-sufficiency, but in reality, it is just a shield. You've spent your life fighting to be seen, but even you don't know who you are when no one is looking." Daniel felt a blow in his stomach. "That's not true," he said harshly. Montiel just smiled. "Isn't it?" Daniel felt the need to respond, to defend himself, but something stopped him. Deep down, I knew the professor was right. That night, Daniel dreamed that he was in a dark room, only illuminated by a dim light. In front of him was an antique mirror with an opulent gilded frame. He approached and saw his reflection. The leader, the strategist, the strong man he had built with so much effort. But then, something changed. The reflection began to distort, as if the glass was melting. And little by little, his image transformed into something more. A child, small, scared, with eyes full of insecurity. Daniel felt the ground open beneath his feet. "No. He whispered in his sleep. "That's not me," but the boy just looked at him. "Sadly, it's always been me," he whispered back. Daniel woke up with his heart pounding. He sat up in bed, breathing heavily. For the first time in his life, he understood the truth. The shadow was not his enemy. It was his own voice, crying out to be heard. And if he wanted to be a true leader, he had to stop running from her. It had to be accepted completely, even in its darkest parts. The sun was slowly setting over the city as Daniel entered an old cafe with dark wood and dim lights. He had been summoned there on the recommendation of Dr. Montiel, who had told him about someone who could help him in his search. "I know. A man who has walked the path that you are starting," he had told her. "Listen to it. Not to find answers, but to understand the right questions." Daniel moved between the tables until he found a man with silver hair and serene eyes, sitting in a corner with a steaming cup of tea. "Daniel, I was waiting for you," the man said with a deep and slow voice. They shook hands. "I'm Gabriel Ferrer," he introduced himself. "I'm told you seek to understand what it really means to be a leader." Daniel nodded. "All my life I have been chasing success, authority, respect. But now I'm not sure if I did it for the right reasons." Gabriel smiled slightly. "Then you are at the most important point of your path, Gabriel. took a sip of his tea before continuing. I was also a young leader, Daniel. Ambitious, determined, sure he had all the answers. I ran companies, gave orders, made difficult decisions. And I thought I was invulnerable. He paused for a moment, as if reliving a painful memory. But what I didn't understand until it was too late is that power without wisdom is a trap. I thought I could do anything until my mistakes hit me hard. I lost important people. I betrayed my own values without realizing it. And when everything collapsed, only then did I understand something essential. What thing? Daniel asked, intrigued, that a leader is not one who imposes his will on others. It is the one that inspires them to find their own path. Daniel felt those words hit him deep inside. Gabriel continued, in mythology and psychology, there is a fundamental archetype, the wise one. It is the one who has failed, who has fallen, who has known the pain of his own limitations, and who, instead of running away from it, has turned it into his greatest strength. Daniel remembered his own fears, his own internal collapse. I've always felt like I had to prove something, he murmured. That if I let my guard down, others would see me as weak. Gabriel nodded in understanding. That's because you still think that leadership is about you. But true leaders don't cling to power. They don't need to prove anything. They lead because they have learned, because they have listened, because they have fallen and gotten up. There was a long silence between the two. Finally, Daniel took a deep breath and said, "So to be a true leader, I must first learn to listen." Gabriel smiled. Exactly. Daniel realized something at that moment. His journey was just beginning, and this time, he was willing to walk through it with humility. Daniel's office was completely silent. Outside, the world continued. Phones ringing, keyboards clacking, conversations muttered. But inside his office, there was only one thought drowning him. In front of him, on his desk, were the reports of a new crucial project for the company. His team had been working on them for weeks, and now it was time to decide. Daniel drummed his fingers on the table. I had two options: going over everything himself, adjusting every detail, making sure everything was exactly how he would make it. Trust your team, delegate responsibility, and accept that others could handle it without your absolute intervention. All his life, Daniel had been convinced that the only way to achieve excellence was to have complete control. Since he was a child, he had been taught that the responsibility was his, that he must bear the weight of success or failure. But now, something inside him told him that this model could not be sustained forever. If you really wanted to lead, you had to learn to trust. Gabriel Ferrer, the mentor he had spoken to days before, had mentioned the concept that he couldn't get out of his mind. A leader is not one who does everything by himself, but one who creates other leaders. It was a powerful idea, but terrifying. He took a deep breath and opened the first report. His immediate instinct was to correct it, polish every detail, make sure everything was done his way. But then, something stopped him. He remembered Montiel's words about the shadow and the fight against his own insecurity. Why do I feel like if I'm not in control, I'm worthless? He closed his eyes and for a moment, allowed himself to imagine what would happen if he delegated. What if his team made mistakes? What if someone else received the credit? What if it turned out that they didn't need him as much as he thought? There was his deepest fear, the fear of being irrelevant. In his quest to understand the archetypes, Daniel had read about the king, the wise ruler who did not need to demonstrate his power, because his greatness lay in empowering others. A true king does not impose his will for fear of losing control. Instead, he guides, trusts, and lets his people prosper. That idea hit him hard. All his life he had believed that a leader had to be strong, dominant, tireless. But great leaders were not those who centralized all power. They were those who knew when to step back and allow others to grow. With his pulse racing, he made a decision. He stood up, grabbed the reports, and walked to the meeting room where his team was waiting. He took a deep breath. "This project is yours," he said, looking them in the eyes. "I trust you." A silence ran through the room. At first, his employees seemed surprised, but then, little by little, they began to smile. That day, Daniel learned a crucial lesson. Leading was not controlling. To lead was to trust. The phone vibrated on the desk with an unsettling insistence. Daniel hesitated before answering. I knew the call brought bad news. "Tell me it's not that serious," he murmured, feeling a knot in his stomach. Daniel. "We have a problem." His assistant's voice was strained. The project he had entrusted his team with, the same one he had decided not to control, was on the brink of collapse. A miscalculation in financial projections had jeopardized the entire operation. If they didn't fix it soon, they would lose a key customer and the company would be hit hard. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. His worst fear was in front of him. Since he had made the decision to delegate, he had tried to convince himself that trusting his team was the right thing to do. But now, with disaster imminent, his mind was screaming that he had made a mistake. If I had done it myself, this wouldn't have happened. If I had checked every detail, everything would be under control. See? You can't trust anyone. That last sentence sounded different. It was his father's voice. Never depend on others. If you want something done right, do it yourself. Those words had shaped him since he was a child. And now, when everything was collapsing, they returned with overwhelming force. The pressure in his chest increased. Suddenly, the office seemed to become darker, more cramped. His breathing became irregular. He closed his eyes and in his mind, he saw himself falling into a bottomless pit. He spiraled downward, faster and faster. Around him, shadows whispered, "You are a fraud. You are not a true leader. You will always need to control everything to be valuable." He struggled to hold on to something, but there was nothing. Just the feeling of infinite fall. Until deep in the darkness, he saw a figure. It was himself, but not the confident and strong Daniel. He was a broken version, a scared boy, the same one who had spent years trying to prove he was good enough to be seen. The Daniel who had never allowed himself to fail. "All this time you have wanted to be a leader," said the shadow, "but in reality you have only wanted to be loved." Daniel felt a blow to his chest. "That's not true. Double quote," he murmured. "Isn't it?" The shadow approached. "If you truly trusted others, this mistake wouldn't affect you like this. But it's not the mistake that hurts you. It is the possibility that without your control, you may not be indispensable." The word pierced him like a dagger. Indispensable. She had built her identity on the idea that without him, everything would collapse. And now, when things were falling apart, his fear wasn't losing the project. It was losing himself. He forced himself to look closer at his shadow. He was not an enemy. It was a part of him. A part he had tried to hide for years. The insecurity, the fear of abandonment, the childish desire to be necessary. And then, in the midst of that darkness, a truth emerged. I don't need to be indispensable to be valuable. At that moment, the fall stopped. Daniel opened his eyes. He was in his office. The phone was still in his hand, his assistant's voice still ringing on the line. But something in him had changed. He sat up straight in his chair and took a breath. "All right. Let's figure it out. What do we do?" his assistant asked desperately. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment and then smiled slightly. "We trust the team. We work together. And we learn from this." For the first time, he truly understood what it meant to lead. It wasn't about control. It was about growing, even when it hurt. Daniel was sitting in his office, but this time, the space no longer felt like a fortress that he had to control. No, now I saw it with different eyes. The projects, the responsibilities, the meetings, everything that had once meant power and success now seemed more like a carefully constructed illusion. He had spent entire nights reflecting after the crisis with his team. Something inside him had changed. He could no longer continue leading in the same way. but was he really ready to let go of what had been his entire identity? On the way home, Daniel decided to stop by his old gym, a place he had stopped frequenting in recent months. It was a place that represented his discipline and his obsession with physical perfection. He entered the locker room and, washing his face, looked up at the mirror. For a moment, he didn't recognize himself. It wasn't because of his appearance, but because of what he saw in his eyes. Before, his reflection always gave him the image of a strong, implacable man with a clear purpose. Now he saw someone tired, someone who had been carrying a weight that did not belong to him. All my life I have built this image, but who am I if I let it go? It was a terrifying question. He recalled one of the conversations with Motiel about archetypes. To be reborn as a true leader, you must first allow your old self to die. It was the essence of many transformation stories. From ancient myths to modern stories, every hero had to undergo a symbolic death before achieving his true power. That resonated deeply within him. That night, Daniel made a decision. He sat at his desk at home, took a piece of paper, and wrote 2 columns. In one, he wrote down everything he believed that defined him as a leader. Absolute control. Perfection. Recognition. Power over others. Admiration. On the other, he wrote what he really wanted to be: inspiration, confidence in your team, purpose beyond the ego, real impact on others. Freedom. When he finished, he knew what he had to do. He took the first leaf and burned it in a small ceramic bowl. He watched the words fade into ashes. It was his way of saying goodbye to the person he had been, to welcome the person he was ready to be. The next day at the office, his team looked at him in surprise when he entered the meeting room and said, "I have something to tell you." Silence fell in the room. For a long time, I have led from a place of control. I have sought to show that I was strong, that I had all the answers. But I was wrong. A true leader is not one who imposes his vision, but rather one who creates space for others to grow. The looks of his team changed. They weren't used to seeing Daniel like this, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to be vulnerable. Starting today, I want us to really work together, fearless, without egos. Because what really matters is not my image, but what we build together. A new chapter had begun. Daniel had died and reborn as the leader he had always needed to be. The sound of keyboards and the hum of conversation filled the office, but there was something different in the atmosphere. Daniel paused for a moment before entering the meeting room. He took a deep breath. This time he did not do it to reinforce his image as an infallible leader, but to connect with the reality of the moment. He was not the same man who had walked through that door weeks ago. He entered with a firm but relaxed step. "Good morning, everyone," he said with a calm voice, without the rigidity of before. His team members looked up. "I want to start this meeting with something different," he continued. "I'm not going to give you orders or tell you what to do. Today, I want to talk to you about what I have learned." Their gazes were fixed on him, expectant. For a long time, I thought that being a leader meant having all the answers. I thought I should be the strongest, the most prepared, the one who never doubted. But the truth is that turned me into someone who trusted control more than people. Some exchanged glances. It wasn't common for Daniel to speak like that. Recently, I faced a crisis that forced me to see who I really was. I realized that leadership is not about imposing, but about inspiring. It's not about control, but about trust. He paused and looked around the room. "So I want to apologize. If you ever felt like I didn't trust you, if I ever made you feel like your work wasn't enough, that wasn't your fault. It was mine." The silence in the room was absolute. Daniel took a deep breath. "Today, I want you to know that I trust each of you, that your ideas are worth it, that this team is not just a group of people working together, but a support network where each one matters." The energy in the room changed. For the first time, Daniel was not alone in his leadership. The rest of the meeting wasn't about him. It was about them. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions instead of giving answers. It allowed each team member to feel like they had an important role. When the meeting ended, his assistant approached him with a smile. "I've never heard you talk like that." Daniel smiled too, because I had never understood what it really meant to be a leader. As he watched his team leave the room, he felt something he hadn't felt before. Peace. I no longer had to prove anything. He no longer needed to be admired. Because for the first time, was really leading. Daniel had transformed. But his story was not unique. Throughout his life, without realizing it, he had played a role that he had not consciously chosen. It had been the tireless warrior, the injured child, the controller king, and including the shadow of his own potential. And the scariest thing was that for years he hadn't even realized it. But. What about you? Who is writing your story? Stop for a moment and ask yourself, are the decisions you make every day your own? Or are they the reflection of a pattern that you learned without questioning? Do you feel trapped in a role that requires you to be strong, intelligent, protective, successful, but that actually wears you down? Do you act from your authenticity, or do you only meet expectations imposed by your family, your environment, society? The truth is that we all have archetypes inside that shape us. Some strengthen us. Others limit us. But only when we are aware of them can we choose what to do with that power. Do you live from fear or from authenticity? There are two paths. Keep living on autopilot, letting these invisible patterns continue to dictate our decisions without us realizing it. Open your eyes, face our shadow, embrace our wounds, and become the true protagonists of our lives. The sun filtered through the windows of Daniel's office. But this time, the shine was different. It was not the light that illuminated a space of pressure and expectations. It was the light that marked the beginning of something new. The road had been long. He had faced his fears, his shadows, and his false beliefs. He had left behind the version of himself that only sought validation and control. And most importantly, he now understood what it really meant to be a leader. A leader is not one who imposes his will. Leader is not one who seeks to be admired. Leader is one who lights the spark of change in others. One day, one of his younger collaborators, Alex, approached him after a meeting. "Daniel, can I ask you a question?" "Of course," he replied with a smile. Alex hesitated for a second before speaking. "I've always seen you as someone strong, someone who had everything under control. But in these last few weeks you have changed, and honestly, now I feel like I can trust you more. How did you achieve that?" Daniel looked at him with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "Because I understood that being strong does not mean having all the answers. It means having the courage to ask the right questions." Alex nodded, reflecting on his words. "So, what makes a true leader?" Daniel took a deep breath before answering. "A true leader does not try to demonstrate his power. Try to awaken power in others." Daniel had already made his decision. He had chosen to lead with authenticity, with trust in his team, with the humility to learn and evolve. But now, the most important question is for you. What kind of leader do you want to be in your own story? Will you be the one who seeks control, or the one who inspires transformation? Because at the end of the day, the true power of a leader, it is not in their domain, but in their ability to change lives. And now, the decision is yours.